the neutral Belgian co-op that swears it can never take a side, and yet holds the one switch that can erase an entire nation from the world economy between one heartbeat and the next. March 17, 2012, 1600 hours Greenwich Mean Time, a precise moment chosen in advance, written into a regulation, counted down to like the launch of a rocket. At that exact second, in banks across Iran, in Tehran, in Isfahan, in Tabriz, the screens did not go red. Nothing exploded. No alarm sounded. Something far quieter and far more total happened. The connection simply ended. Some 30 Iranian financial institutions, including the central bank of a nation of nearly 80 million people, were severed in a single stroke from the network that carries the messages behind almost every international payment on Earth. One moment, Iran was wired into the bloodstream of global commerce. The next moment, it was not. A country the size of Western Europe had, in the span of a single clock tick, been amputated from the world economy. There was no army involved. No blockade of ships, no mined harbor, no bomb. The most devastating economic weapon deployed against Iran in a generation was not fired. It was switched off. And the instrument that did it was not a government, not a treasury, not a fleet, but a quiet, ferociously private cooperative headquartered in a leafy suburb of Brussels. A company that had spent nearly 40 years insisting, to anyone who would listen, that it was the most neutral organization on the face of the planet. Its name is SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. And here is the paradox that sits at the dead center of this story, the paradox that makes it one of the strangest and most important tales in the architecture of modern power. SWIFT insists, sincerely, repeatedly, as a matter of its deepest institutional faith, that it cannot take sides, that it is a mere utility, a neutral messenger, a post office for banks that has no more business choosing winners and losers than the telephone company has choosing what you say into the phone. SWIFT will tell you, in its own official language, that it will never make a unilateral decision to disconnect anyone from its network as a result of political pressure. It swears it is not a weapon. It swears it does not have a trigger. And yet, on March 17, 2012, at exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Greenwich time, an entire nation went dark. So, which is it? How can an organization be both the most neutral utility on Earth and the holder of a kill switch capable of economically strangling a country of 80 million? How can a company sincerely believe it can never choose a side, while its hand is on the single most powerful non-military weapon in the modern arsenal? Who exactly flipped the switch that day? Because it was not, in the end, quite SWIFT itself. And it was not, exactly, the government you're thinking of either. The answer is a story about the most dangerous kind of power there is, the kind that everyone denies holding, precisely because everyone is holding a piece of it. It is a story of a switch that no single hand admits to controlling, and that has been thrown, now, against Iran, against Russia, against the banks of half a dozen states, each time by an institution swearing it had no choice. To understand who really holds the switch is to understand who really rules the plumbing of the 21st century. Because the terrifying truth is not that one villain controls the kill switch. It is that the kill switch works precisely because no one will admit to holding it, and that is exactly what makes it impossible to stop. To understand why cutting a country off from SWIFT is an act of economic warfare and not merely an inconvenience, you have to understand what the network actually does and how completely the modern world has come to depend on it without ever noticing. SWIFT does not move money. This is the first thing to understand, and it is the source of endless confusion. Not a single dollar, euro, real, or ruble ever travels through SWIFT's wires. What travels through SWIFT is instructions, the standardized, secure messages that tell one bank to pay another. The precise electronic paperwork that says, move this amount from this account to that account now. SWIFT is the language in which the banks of the world speak to one another. It is the grammar of every international payment. The money moves through the correspondent banking system, but the word to move it moves through SWIFT. And that turns out to be everything. Because in a global economy, an instruction that cannot be sent is a payment that cannot be made. If you cannot send the message, the money does not move, no matter how much of it you have, no matter how solvent you are, no matter how badly both sides want the transaction to happen. A nation cut off from SWIFT is a nation that has lost the ability to speak to the global banking system. Its banks are still full of money. Its exporters still have oil or gas or grain to sell. Its importers still need medicine and machinery and food. But the sentences that would arrange all of that commerce can no longer be transmitted. The country is not poorer, it is mute. And in the modern economy, to be financially mute is to starve with a full warehouse. The scale of the dependency is almost impossible to overstate, and it was built up so gradually, so invisibly, that no one ever chose it in a single deliberate act. From its founding by 239 banks in 1973, SWIFT grew into the near universal standard, linking, in time, some 11,000 financial institutions across more than 200 countries and territories, carrying the messaging behind trillions of dollars of value every single day. It won this position not by conquest, but by convenience. It was cheaper, safer, and more reliable than anything else. One by one, the banks of the world plugged in, until being on SWIFT was simply what it meant to be a bank that did business abroad. There was no alternative because no alternative was needed. The universality was the product. And universality, it turns out, is indistinguishable from a monopoly. And a monopoly on the world's financial messaging is indistinguishable from a chokehold in the hands of anyone able to close it. This is why, in the quiet vocabulary of sanctions specialists and central bankers, cutting a nation off from SWIFT acquired a nickname that tells you everything about how it is understood by the people who wield it. They call it the nuclear option. Not a strong sanction, not a severe measure. The nuclear option. The weapon of last resort. The one so devastating that its use is almost as feared by the wielder as by the target. Because unlike a bomb, which destroys a factory or a bridge, disconnection from SWIFT attacks something more fundamental, a country's ability to participate in the modern economy at all. It does not blow up the wealth, it freezes the ability to use it. It is, in the most literal sense available, a switch, a binary, on or off, connected or severed switch, wired directly into the survival of a national economy. Which raises, with unavoidable force, the question this entire story exists to answer. A weapon this total does not lie around unowned. Someone's hand rests on that switch. Someone decided at 1600 hours Greenwich Mean Time on March 17, 2012, that Iran would go dark. So whose hand was it? The company that threw the switch swears it never chooses to throw the switch. To see how that can possibly be true, you have to understand the promise SWIFT made at its birth, and the trapdoor hidden inside that promise. Everything about SWIFT was designed, from the very beginning, to make the events of 2012 impossible. That is the deepest irony of this story. The neutrality was not an accident or an afterthought. It was the entire architecture. And it failed anyway, not despite the design, but because of a flaw built into the very heart of it. When those 239 banks from 15 countries came together in 1973 to build a shared network, they understood immediately that the thing would only work if everyone trusted it, and everyone would only trust it if it belonged to no one in particular and served no master. A messaging system owned by an American bank would never be trusted by a Soviet one. A network controlled by London would never be embraced by Tokyo. So they built SWIFT as a cooperative, owned collectively by its member banks, governed for their mutual benefit, incorporated deliberately under the law of Belgium, a small, neutral European country that threatened no one and sat astride no empire. They planted its headquarters not in a financial capital, but in Hulpe, a quiet green suburb outside Brussels, as if to say, we are nobodies. We belong to the system itself. The governance was engineered for the same purpose, to prevent any single power from ever seizing the wheel. SWIFT is run by a board of 25 directors, drawn from the banks of the world, with each nation's representation tied to how heavily its institutions use the network. The big users get more seats, the small ones share. Above the board sits a layer of oversight exercised by the central banks of the major economies, the G10 central banks, the Bank of England, the Federal Reserve, the Bank of Japan, and their peers, with the National Bank of Belgium as lead overseer and the European Central Bank at the table. It sounds formidable. It sounds like control. But here is the strange and crucial fact that almost no one knows, the fact that makes the whole system so much more fragile and so much more dangerous than it appears. That oversight has no binding legal framework whatsoever. The central banks that oversee SWIFT cannot fine it. They cannot enforce rules upon it. They cannot compel it to change a single practice. The official instrument of their authority is a phrase that sounds almost quaint: moral suasion, persuasion, the raised eyebrow, the quiet word. The overseers of the world's most critical financial network govern it, formally by asking nicely. There is no button they can press. There is no law that binds SWIFT to their will. The most systemically important private company on the planet floats, by design, in a deliberate legal vacuum, accountable to everyone in principle and to no one in enforceable fact. And out of that design came the promise, the sacred, oft-repeated institutional article of faith that SWIFT recites to this day. We are neutral. We are a utility. We do not choose sides. We will not make unilateral decisions to cut anyone off in response to political pressure. For decades, this was not merely a slogan. It was the literal operating truth. Governments raged, wars were fought, regimes were despised, and SWIFT carried their messages all the same. Because carrying every message without judgment was the whole point of existing. To disconnect a member for political reasons would have been to betray the founding covenant, to become the very thing the neutrality was built to prevent, a weapon. But read that promise again, very carefully, because the trapdoor is hidden in a single word. SWIFT will not act unilaterally. It will not, on its own, choose to disconnect anyone. And that is not the same thing, not remotely the same thing as saying it will never disconnect anyone at all. The promise of neutrality was never a promise that the switch would never be thrown. It was only a promise that SWIFT's own hand would never be the one to throw it voluntarily, which left one enormous, load-bearing question quietly unanswered, waiting like a landmine under 40 years of assurances. What happens when someone with the force of law orders SWIFT to throw it? The answer arrived in 2012, and it revealed that the neutrality was never a wall. It was a door, and someone had just found the legal key. Here is the elegant, almost magical trick at the heart of how the kill switch is actually thrown. A trick so clean that everyone involved can walk away with their conscience and their reputation intact, each pointing at the other, and the switch gets thrown all the same. Remember the founding decision that was supposed to guarantee SWIFT's neutrality? They incorporated it under the law of Belgium. Neutral little Belgium, threatening no one. For 40 years, that Belgian domicile was a shield, proof that SWIFT belonged to no great power. But a company incorporated in Belgium is a company subject to Belgian law, and Belgium is a member of the European Union, which means SWIFT, this supposedly stateless, ownerless, neutral global utility, is, in the most concrete legal sense, a European company, bound absolutely and inescapably to obey European law. Now watch how the trick works. SWIFT swears it will never choose to disconnect anyone. It swears it will never act unilaterally on political pressure. And it keeps that promise, technically, literally, immaculately, because it does not need to choose. In March 2012, the Council of the European Union passed a regulation, EU Regulation 267/2012, which made it flatly illegal for any specialized financial messaging provider operating in Europe to serve the sanctioned banks of Iran. It was no longer a question of politics or pressure or preference. It was now the law. And SWIFT, as a law-abiding Belgian company, had no choice but to comply. It did not decide to cut Iran off. It was ordered to. By a legal authority, it was bound to obey. Its hands, it could say with a straight face, were tied. Look at the exquisite division of labor this creates, the way it launders responsibility until no one is holding it. SWIFT gets to keep its neutrality. We didn't choose this. We were compelled by law. We are still a neutral utility. We simply obey the jurisdictions we operate in. And this was not reluctant spin. SWIFT genuinely wanted it this way. When the pressure to cut Iran off mounted, the company did something revealing. It explicitly looked to the European Union for political cover. It did not want to act on its own authority, because to act on its own authority would be to admit it had authority, to admit the switch was real and its hand was on it. So it waited for the EU to make disconnection a legal command, so that it could disconnect while sincerely insisting it had never chosen to. The regulation was not just a legal instrument, it was an alibi, requested and gratefully received. Meanwhile, the European Union gets to say, we merely passed a sanctions regulation, as sovereign governments are entitled to do. We did not personally unplug any cables. That was SWIFT's technical operation. Each party performs a genuine, narrow, defensible role. The EU legislates, SWIFT complies, and an entire nation goes dark, with no single actor ever having to stand up and say, I am the one who did this to 80 million people. The responsibility dissolves into the machinery. This is the sleight of hand. The switch is thrown by a chain of actors, each of whom is telling the truth when they say they were only doing their small, lawful part. The neutrality survives. The nation still goes dark. Both things are true. But this only pushes the real question one step further back, into the shadows where the actual power lives. Fine. SWIFT was compelled by the EU. But who compelled the EU? Why did the Council of the European Union, an institution not famous for swift or unanimous action, suddenly summon the political will to reach across the Atlantic-facing width of a continent and pull the most feared financial trigger in existence? The EU did not wake up one morning in 2012 seized with the urge to strangle Iran's economy. Someone moved it. And to find that hand, you have to leave Brussels entirely, cross an ocean, and walk into a chamber of the United States Congress. Because the European glove that threw the switch had an American hand inside it, and that hand had just made SWIFT's own directors an offer they could not refuse. The United States faced a genuine and maddening problem in 2011 and 2012, and the way it solved that problem reveals more about the true nature of the kill switch than any official document ever will. Washington wanted Iran cut off from SWIFT. It had wanted it for years, as the centerpiece of a campaign to force Tehran to abandon its nuclear program. But the United States confronted a legal wall it could not simply climb. SWIFT is not an American company. It is a Belgian cooperative, governed by European law, physically headquartered outside Brussels, beyond the direct reach of any American statute. The President of the United States cannot order a Belgian company to do anything. Congress cannot legislate the internal operations of a firm on another continent. On paper, SWIFT was untouchable, sovereignly, jurisdictionally out of America's hands. And so, American power did what American financial power has become extraordinarily skilled at doing. If it could not command the company, it would go after the people. In 2012, two United States senators, Robert Menendez of New Jersey and Mark Kirk of Illinois, authored an amendment of chilling elegance. The Menendez-Kirk amendment did not attempt the impossible task of ordering SWIFT to do anything. Instead, it granted the executive branch of the United States government the authority to impose sanctions on SWIFT itself, and, crucially, on SWIFT's individual directors and its significant shareholders, if the network continued to provide services to Iran's sanctioned banks. Read that again and feel the precision of the threat. The men and women who sat on SWIFT's board of 25 directors, respectable senior bankers from the great financial institutions of Europe and beyond, were being told, in effect, keep serving Iran and you personally may be barred from the United States. Your bank may be frozen out of the American financial system. Your access to the dollar, the currency that underpins your entire institution, may be revoked. For a senior European banker, exclusion from the American financial system is not a policy disagreement. It is professional and institutional annihilation. No major bank on earth can function while cut off from the dollar and the American market. The threat did not need to be carried out. It only needed to be credible, and it was overwhelmingly credible. The United States Senate passed the measure with a vote that tells you how little controversy there was about wielding this power. 100-0. Unanimous. And Congress paired it with a requirement that the Treasury report within 90 days on precisely how successful the effort to force SWIFT to cut off Iran had been. The screws were not just turned. They were turned on a public timetable, with a receipt demanded. Now, watch the machine complete itself and see the true shape of who holds the switch. The United States could not legally throw it, so it applied unbearable pressure, not to SWIFT, the abstract institution, but to the flesh and blood human beings who governed it and the banks that owned it. Those humans, facing personal and corporate ruin, needed SWIFT to comply. And SWIFT, to comply without shattering its precious neutrality, needed the legal cover of an EU regulation so that it could disconnect Iran while swearing it had merely obeyed the law. So the pressure flowed onward from Washington into Brussels until the European Union passed Regulation 267/2012, which gave SWIFT the lawful order it needed, which SWIFT then dutifully executed, which sent 30 Iranian banks dark at 1600 hours Greenwich Mean Time. Each link in the chain could honestly deny holding the switch. The Americans: we only sanctioned, as is our right. The senators: we only authorized. We didn't compel a foreign firm. The EU: we only regulated our own companies. SWIFT: we only obeyed the law. And Iran went dark with the fingerprints of no single hand on the trigger. This is the real anatomy of the kill switch, and it is far more disturbing than a simple story of one villain with one button. The switch is thrown by a chain of pressure that begins in the American Congress, passes through the vulnerability of individual European bankers, laundered through European law into a Belgian company's dutiful compliance. American power does not need to own the switch. It only needs to own the people standing near it. And in a world where every serious bank depends on access to the dollar, America owns, in this sense, nearly everyone. The neutrality of SWIFT was real. It was also, against a power that could threaten its directors with financial death, utterly beside the point. They had proven the switch could be thrown. Now the world would see what it does to the country on the other side of it, and Iran would become the laboratory in which the most powerful economic weapon of the age was tested on 80 million human beings. What does it actually do to a country, throwing the switch? Iran became the answer, the first large-scale, real-world test of the nuclear option, and the results were studied by every finance ministry and central bank on the planet, because they revealed both the terrifying power of the weapon and, more quietly, its limits. The damage was swift, deep, and measurable, and it fell, as economic warfare always does, most heavily on the ordinary and the innocent. In the year of the disconnection, Iran's gross domestic product contracted by roughly 5.8%, an entire economy thrown violently into reverse. The blow to the country's lifeblood, its oil exports, was even more brutal. Revenues from oil, the artery through which nearly all of Iran's hard currency flowed, were slashed almost in half, collapsing from around $92.5 billion to roughly $52 billion. Nearly half the value of the nation's most vital industry wiped out. Not because the oil stopped flowing, but because the messages arranging its sale could no longer be sent. And for ordinary Iranians, the effect was a slow strangulation of daily life. As the currency collapsed and inflation tore through the economy, some estimates put the fall in real private sector wages at 35 to 40%. Nearly half the value of a family's earnings evaporated. But the cruelest wounds were the ones that no sanctions regime ever officially intends, and every sanctions regime always inflicts. When a country cannot send or receive international financial messages, it cannot easily pay for imports. And among the things a modern country imports are medicines and the raw materials to make them. Reports mounted through the sanctions years of Iranians struggling to obtain drugs for cancer, for hemophilia, for multiple sclerosis, not because such medicines were formally banned, but because the financial channels to pay foreign suppliers had been choked shut. This is the hidden face of the kill switch, the part that never appears in the press releases. It does not distinguish between a nuclear scientist and a child needing chemotherapy. It severs the whole nation's ability to transact, and the consequences fall where they fall. The weapon is aimed at a government. It lands on a population. And yet, this is the part the laboratory revealed that its designers found less comfortable. The switch did not simply end the story. Iran did not surrender overnight. It adapted, painfully and expensively. It turned to barter, to gold, to networks of front companies and informal money transfer systems, to friendly banks in states willing to defy Washington. It sold its oil at a discount through back channels. The economy was mauled, but it did not die, and the regime did not fall. The nuclear option, it turned out, was devastating but not omnipotent, a weapon that could inflict enormous pain without necessarily producing surrender. And that lesson, learned in the Iranian laboratory, would echo forward ominously toward the day the switch would be aimed at a far larger and far better prepared adversary. There was one more lesson, and it was the most important of all. The switch, once thrown, could be thrown back. In 2016, as part of the international nuclear agreement known as the JCPOA, Iranian banks were reconnected to SWIFT. The switch reversed. The nation plugged back into the global bloodstream as a reward for concessions. And then, in 2018, when the United States, under a new administration, abandoned that agreement, the pressure to cut Iran off again came roaring back. And once more, SWIFT found itself squeezed between an American demand and its own protestations of neutrality, eventually disconnecting sanctioned Iranian banks a second time. On, then off, then on again. The kill switch was not a one-time detonation. It was a permanent feature of the landscape now, a valve that could be opened and closed as the political winds shifted, a standing instrument of coercion that would remain wired into Iran's economy for a decade and more. The weapon had been normalized. It had a user's manual now, and the world had watched the whole demonstration. The Iranian experiment answered the question of what the switch does to a small, isolated adversary. But everyone who studied it was really asking a different question. What happens when you try to throw it against a giant? In February 2022, the world found out. When Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine in February 2022, the demand went up almost instantly from Kyiv and from capitals across the West. Cut Russia off from SWIFT. Throw the nuclear switch. And what happened next revealed the deepest truth about the kill switch of all, that it is a weapon which cuts the hand that wields it, and that against a large enough target, the wielder flinches. The demand was ferocious and immediate. Ukraine's president pleaded for it publicly. Sanctions hawks across Europe and America called for the total, immediate, complete disconnection of Russia, the full nuclear option. The entire country severed at a stroke, exactly as Iran had been. And for a few days, the West hesitated in a way that infuriated Kyiv and puzzled the public. Why the delay? Why not simply flip the switch that everyone knew existed? The answer exposed the weapon's essential paradox. Russia was not Iran. Russia was one of the largest economies on Earth, the supplier of a vast share of Europe's natural gas and oil, woven so deeply into the European economy that severing it completely would send the shock ricocheting straight back into the homes and factories of the very countries wielding the weapon. To fully throw the switch on Russia was to risk freezing German homes and shuttering European industry through the winter. The nuclear option, against a giant, threatened fallout that would drift back over the ones who launched it. So the West did something that told you everything about the true nature of the switch. It threw it only part way. On the 2nd of March, 2022, the European Union agreed to disconnect a carefully chosen set of Russian banks from SWIFT, 7 of them at first, including VTB, Russia's second-largest lender, along with Bank Otkritia, Novacombank, Promsvyazbank, Bank Rossiya, Sovcombank, and the development bank VEB, with the disconnection taking legal effect on the 12th of March. In May, a second wave followed, sweeping in Sberbank, Russia's single largest bank, along with the Credit Bank of Moscow and the Russian Agricultural Bank. Formidable. But look at what was deliberately left connected, and you see the wielder's flinch made concrete. Gazprom Bank, the financial artery through which Europe paid Russia for its gas and oil, was pointedly not cut off. It was exempted, carved out, protected, preventing because Europe still needed to send those messages, still needed to keep paying for the energy on which its own economy depended. The switch that had severed Iran completely was, against Russia, thrown with a trembling hand and a long list of exceptions. This was the nuclear option, revealed as something less than absolute. A weapon whose full use is restrained not by mercy, but by self-interest, by the wielder's own entanglement with the target. Sanctions specialists drew the distinction sharply. Being placed on a sanctions list and being disconnected from SWIFT are not the same thing, and the partial, surgical nature of the Russian cutoff showed a West trying to inflict maximum pain on its adversary while sparing itself the worst of the blowback. The switch, it turned out, was not a simple on or off toggle when aimed at a country large enough to matter. It was a dial, turned carefully, with the wielder watching its own reflection in the readout, flinching every time the pain threatened to rebound. And there was a deeper problem still, one that the throwers of the switch understood even as they threw it, and that would ultimately prove the most consequential thing about the entire episode. Russia, unlike Iran in 2012, had seen this coming. It had watched Iran go dark. It had felt the switch brush against its own neck once already. And in the years between, it had spent enormous effort building something the West had not reckoned with, an escape hatch of its own making. The kill switch was about to teach its wielders the lesson that every monopolist eventually learns the hard way, that the surest way to destroy your monopoly is to use it as a weapon. Because every single time the switch is thrown, the whole world watches. And every nation that is not throwing it starts, quietly, to build a door that the hand on the switch can never reach. The final truth of the kill switch is the one its wielders least wanted to confront, that the weapon destroys itself a little more every time it is fired. And Russia had been building the proof for 8 years. Cast back to 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea and war ignited in eastern Ukraine, the West responded with sanctions, and, for the first time, floated the threat of the nuclear option, of cutting Russia off from SWIFT. In the end, the switch was not thrown then, but the threat was heard, in Moscow, with absolute clarity. And Russia did the rational thing, the thing any state watching Iran's fate would do. It began, immediately, to build its own alternative. That same year, 2014, the Russian central bank started developing a domestic financial messaging system of its own, the System for Transfer of Financial Messages, known by its Russian initials as SPFS, explicitly as insurance against the day the Western switch might be thrown. It tested it, refined it, and officially launched it in December 2017. By the time the partial cutoff came in 2022, Russia already had a functioning, if inferior, escape hatch, a domestic network its banks could fall back on, and one it began working to connect to friendly states abroad, with hundreds of institutions across a growing list of countries eventually linking in. And Russia was not building alone, because it was not the only power watching the switch with unease. China, the second largest economy on Earth, and a state acutely aware that it too could one day find itself on the wrong end of the nuclear option, had built its own cross-border payment system, known as CIPS, the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, steadily expanding its reach to well over 1,000 participating institutions across scores of countries. Every use of the SWIFT switch against Iran, against Russia, was a live advertisement to Beijing, to New Delhi, to every capital that could imagine itself someday out of favor with Washington and Brussels, of exactly why they needed an exit, a payment channel that the hand on the Western switch could never reach. Iran built workarounds, Russia built SPFS, China built CIPS, and each of these systems, born directly out of the fear of the switch, chipped away at the one thing that made the switch lethal in the first place: SWIFT's near-total, near-universal monopoly. This is the reckoning, and it is the quiet tragedy embedded in the whole architecture of financial power. The kill switch works only as long as there is no alternative. Only as long as being cut off from SWIFT means being cut off from the world, period, with nowhere else to go. The switch's devastating power is SWIFT's universality. But every time the switch is thrown, it teaches the watching world that universality has become a vulnerability. That dependence on a single Western-governed network is a knife held permanently at the throat. And so the world responds by fragmenting, by building rival systems, regional networks, workarounds, and alternatives, none as good as SWIFT, all of them diminishing SWIFT's monopoly a little further. The weapon, in other words, spins the very thing that makes it powerful. Each firing is also an act of self-disarmament. The more you use the nuclear option, the more you accelerate the construction of a world in which the nuclear option no longer works. The wielders know this. It is the reason for the hesitation, the carve-outs, the trembling hand in the long list of exceptions. They understand that they are not merely punishing an adversary. They are teaching the entire non-Western world to route around them, to build a financial internet they do not control, to migrate slowly, expensively, but inexorably toward a fractured system of rival plumbing in which no single switch can ever again black out a nation. The dollar-based, SWIFT-centered financial order gave the West a weapon of breathtaking power. But it is a weapon that can only be fired a finite number of times before the target learns to armor itself and the weapon corrodes in the hand. Which brings us back, at the very last, to that suburb outside Brussels, and to the strange, sincere, and quietly false thing that SWIFT says about itself. We are neutral. We are just a utility. We do not choose sides. We would never throw the switch. Every word of it is true, and all of it together is a fiction. Because the switch does not require SWIFT to choose. It requires only that SWIFT exist, universal and indispensable, and legally bound, sitting at the one choke point through which the world's money must speak. The founders built a neutral post office and believed neutrality would protect it. What they actually built was the most powerful, non-military weapon of the age, disguised as a piece of infrastructure, waiting in a Belgian field for a chain of frightened bankers and determined governments to reach past the neutrality and turn the valve. They swore it could never take a side, and it never did. It simply held the switch and let the world fight over whose hand would throw it. The most neutral institution on Earth turned out to hold the deadliest switch on Earth. And the final, unsettling lesson of Iran, of Russia, of every nation blacked out between one heartbeat and the next, is not that the switch is too terrible to use. It is that every time it is used, it teaches the world to build a switch of its own, until the day arrives when there is no single switch left to throw, and the most fearsome weapon of our era quietly stops working, killed not by its enemies, but by the hand that could never resist reaching for it.